Margaret Whitmore had always believed that growing old meant accepting smaller losses. First, it was her eyesight. Then the aching knees that complained every morning. Then her husband, Thomas, whose favorite rocking chair still sat untouched on the front porch nearly 6 years after his passing. But she had never imagined that a single misstep would change everything. It happened on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Margaret had been carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry upstairs when the telephone rang. Distracted, she turned too quickly toward the sound. Her slipper slipped against the polished wooden stair. The basket flew from her hands. Then came the sickening feeling of weightlessness. 1 step, 2, 3. By the time she stopped tumbling, she was lying at the bottom of the staircase, unable to catch her breath. Pain shot through her left hip. The ceiling above her blurred. Her trembling fingers reached for the cordless phone that had landed nearby. She managed to dial only one number. Her son's. Daniel Whitmore arrived in less than 15 minutes. "Mom?" He dropped to his knees beside her. "Don't move. I'm calling an ambulance." His voice was calm, steady, exactly what she needed. As the paramedics carefully loaded her onto a stretcher, Daniel climbed into the ambulance without hesitation. "I'll stay with her." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Thank you." He smiled warmly. "You don't ever have to thank me. I'm your son." For the first time since Thomas had died, Margaret felt something she hadn't realized she missed. She didn't feel alone. Maple Ridge Medical Center bustled with the quiet rhythm of a weekend emergency department. Doctors ordered X-rays, blood tests, CT scans. Fortunately, nothing appeared life-threatening. "No fractures," the physician explained. "But at your age, we'd like to keep you overnight for observation." Daniel nodded before Margaret could answer. "I think that's the best idea." The doctor smiled approvingly. "You have a caring son, Mrs. Whitmore?" Margaret couldn't help smiling. "I know." The following morning, Daniel seemed to be everywhere at once. He brought her favorite blueberry muffins from the bakery across town. He adjusted her pillows before the nurses even asked. He carried fresh flowers into the room, replacing the wilted arrangement left by a neighbor. Whenever a doctor entered, Daniel stood politely and listened with genuine interest. "If there's anything my mother needs," he said repeatedly, "please tell me." The hospital staff noticed. "So many families barely visit," one young nurse whispered. "Your son never leaves." Margaret's heart filled with quiet pride. Maybe losing her balance on those stairs had reminded Daniel how precious time together really was. Maybe people did change. Maybe grief eventually softened everyone. Not everyone seemed convinced. Late that afternoon, Margaret noticed one particular nurse watching Daniel from the hallway. Her name tag read, Evelyn Brooks, RN. Unlike the younger nurses, Evelyn moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades caring for patients. Nothing escaped her attention. She noticed when medications were late, when patients looked anxious, when relatives smiled a little too perfectly. Several times Margaret caught Evelyn glancing toward Daniel while pretending to review charts. It seemed odd, but she thought little of it. That evening, Daniel checked his phone. "I'm going downstairs for coffee. You want anything?" Margaret smiled. "Just come back." "I will." He kissed her forehead before leaving the room. The hallway became quiet. Outside the window, the last orange light of sunset faded behind the city skyline. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Evelyn entered carrying a clipboard. "How are we feeling tonight?" "A little sore." "I imagine so." She checked Margaret's blood pressure with practiced hands. Normal. She listened to her heartbeat. Strong. She made a few notes. Then, she looked toward the hallway. No one was there. She quietly closed the room's door. Margaret frowned. "Is something wrong?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer until she stood beside the hospital bed. Her expression had changed. The warm professional smile was gone. In its place was something Margaret couldn't quite identify. Concern. Real concern. Evelyn leaned down, lowering her voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret instinctively leaned closer. The nurse's eyes never left hers. Please. She paused as if carefully choosing every word. Don't trust your son. Margaret felt her heartbeat stumble. What? Evelyn glanced toward the hallway again. There isn't time. What do you mean? Why would you say that? But the nurse straightened immediately. The expression of concern disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Someone pushed a medication cart past the doorway. Evelyn opened the chart in her hands as though nothing unusual had happened. I'll check on you again later. Then she walked out. The door clicked softly behind her. Margaret remained frozen. Don't trust your son. The words echoed over and over inside her mind. There had to be some mistake. Daniel had been wonderful. He hadn't left her side. He brought flowers. He remembered her favorite muffins. He spoke kindly to every nurse. Why would anyone warn her against a son like that? No, it didn't make sense. Yet something about Evelyn's eyes refused to leave her thoughts. They weren't frightened. They were certain. Nearly midnight, Margaret was still awake. The room was dark except for the faint glow of medical monitors. She reached for the call button, then stopped. Perhaps she was overthinking. Perhaps the nurse had confused her with another patient. She closed her eyes. Then, voices drifted through the partially open door. One of them belonged to Daniel. His tone was no longer warm and cheerful. It was low, sure, almost impatient. Margaret slowly sat up in bed despite the pain in her hip. She held her breath and listened. Another unfamiliar man's voice answered from the hallway. The words were too quiet to understand. Then Daniel spoke again. This time, Margaret caught only a few chilling fragments. She won't remember. Pause. The sooner we finish. Another pause. Everything transfers automatically. Margaret's blood ran cold. She stared toward the doorway, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and for the very first time in her life, she wondered if the nurse's whispered warning had been the truth. Margaret Whitmore didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The words she had overheard echoed through her mind with unsettling clarity. She won't remember. The sooner we finish. Everything transfers automatically. She tried convincing herself there had to be another explanation. Perhaps Daniel was discussing insurance paperwork. Maybe he was arranging payment for her hospital stay. There were dozens of innocent possibilities. Yet none of them explained why Nurse Evelyn had leaned close enough to whisper, "Don't trust your son." By sunrise, Margaret felt more exhausted than she had after the fall. At 7 o'clock, the curtains were pulled open by a cheerful young nurse. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore." The room filled with soft morning light. "Did you sleep well?" Margaret forced a smile. "A little." Her answer was technically true. She had slept. Just not for very long. The nurse checked her temperature and blood pressure before leaving with a friendly wave. Only moments later, Daniel walked into the room carrying 2 paper bags. "Morning, Mom." He smiled exactly as he always had. "I brought your favorite breakfast." The smell of fresh pancakes and maple syrup filled the room. "You remembered." "I remember everything." He set the tray across her lap, carefully arranging the napkin and silverware. "I even got extra strawberries." Margaret looked at him closely. His face appeared relaxed. His voice was warm. If she hadn't heard the conversation outside her room the night before, she would have believed nothing had changed. But now, she found herself studying every smile, every gesture, every word. "Is something wrong?" Daniel asked suddenly. Margaret realized she had been staring at him. "No. You've been awfully quiet." "I'm just tired." "That's understandable." He reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "The doctors think you'll probably go home tomorrow." "That would be nice." "I've already started getting the house ready." Margaret blinked. "You have?" "I cleaned the kitchen. I bought groceries. I even hired someone to mow your lawn." She nodded slowly. "That was thoughtful." Daniel smiled again. "I just want you to focus on getting better." Everything he said sounded exactly like what a loving son should say, which somehow made Margaret even more uneasy. Late that morning, Dr. Raymond Keller stopped by during his rounds. "How are we feeling today, Mrs. Whitmore?" A little stronger. Excellent. He glanced at the chart. If everything continues to improve, we should be able to discharge you tomorrow afternoon. Daniel stood beside the bed. I'll take good care of her. I'm sure you will, Dr. Keller replied. Before leaving, the physician smiled at Margaret. You're fortunate. Not everyone has family this devoted. Margaret managed another polite smile. Yes. I suppose I am. But as the doctor disappeared into the hallway, doubt quietly settled back into her heart. The afternoon passed slowly. Daniel stepped out several times to answer phone calls, always returning with the same reassuring smile. I'm just taking care of a few business things. Margaret nodded, pretending not to notice that he never answered those calls inside the room. Every conversation happened somewhere beyond the door. Somewhere she couldn't hear. Just after 4 o'clock, Daniel's phone rang again. I'll only be a minute. He walked into the hallway, leaving the door slightly open. Margaret wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the silence of the hospital carried voices farther than either of them realized. She heard Daniel speak first. No, not yet. Pause. We'll probably finish tomorrow. Another pause. I know. His voice became lower. I just need her signature. Margaret's fingers tightened around the blanket. Signature? Signature for what? She leaned slightly toward the door. The second voice was too distant to understand. Then Daniel answered again. No. She hasn't questioned anything. A long silence followed. Finally he laughed softly. Trust me. It'll be done. Footsteps approached. Margaret quickly leaned back against her pillow just as Daniel re-entered the room. Everything okay? She asked. Business, he replied casually. Nothing important. An hour later, Nurse Evelyn entered carrying fresh medication. Unlike the previous evening, she spoke very little. She checked Margaret's adjusted the monitor, and glanced briefly toward the hallway. Daniel was speaking with another nurse at the station. Evelyn leaned over the bed to straighten Margaret's blanket. As she did, Margaret felt something small slide beneath her hand. The nurse never looked directly at her. She simply whispered, "Not now." Then she walked away. Margaret waited until Evelyn disappeared before lifting the corner of the blanket. A small folded piece of paper rested beneath it. Her pulse quickened. She carefully unfolded it. Inside were only 9 handwritten words. Asked to see your medication chart. Don't sign anything today. Margaret stared at the message. No explanation. No signature. She didn't need one. She recognized Evelyn's handwriting from the notes on her bedside chart. Her heart pounded. Medication chart? Why would that matter? And why specifically today? Before she could think further, Daniel returned carrying a bouquet of fresh lilies. For you. They're beautiful. He placed them beside the window. Oh, by the way. He reached into his leather briefcase. I almost forgot. He removed a neatly organized folder. There's just a little paperwork the hospital asked us to complete before you're discharged. Margaret's eyes immediately dropped to the folder. Paperwork. The same word she had heard the previous night. The same word connected to a signature. Daniel opened the folder with practiced ease. Nothing complicated. Mostly routine forms. He smiled reassuringly. We can go through them after dinner. Margaret felt the folded note still hidden beneath the blanket. Don't sign anything today. For the first time in her life, she did something that surprised even herself. She smiled gently at her son. Let's wait until tomorrow. Daniel's smile froze for the briefest moment. So we don't forget. I'm rather tired. It'll only take 5 minutes. I know. She kept her voice calm. But I'd rather read everything when my head feels clearer. A flicker of irritation crossed Daniel's face. Gone almost instantly. Of course. He closed the folder. No rush. Yet Margaret noticed something she had never seen before. His fingers tightened around the briefcase handle. Not with patience. With frustration. It lasted only a second. But it was enough. As Daniel turned toward the window, Margaret looked down at the hidden note once more. Then, for the first time since arriving at the hospital, she made a decision. Tomorrow? before signing a single piece of paper. She would ask to see her medication chart, and she would find out why an experienced nurse believed her own son couldn't be trusted. Margaret Whitmore barely touched her breakfast the next morning. The oatmeal sat untouched on the tray while she replayed the events of the last 2 days. Nurse Evelyn's warning. The mysterious note hidden beneath her blanket. Daniel's insistence that she sign routine paperwork. For 78 years, Margaret had trusted her instincts. Now, for the first time, she wondered if she had ignored them for too long. Around 8 o'clock, a young nurse entered to check her vital signs. Her name tag read Emily Sanders, RN. She greeted Margaret with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. How are you feeling today?" "A little stronger." "That's wonderful." Emily adjusted the blood pressure cuff before making notes on a tablet. Margaret hesitated. Then she remembered the note. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Could I see my medication chart?" Emily looked mildly surprised. "Certainly." Most patients never asked. She opened the electronic chart on the bedside computer and turned the screen toward Margaret. "These are all the medications you've received since admission." Margaret slowly scanned the list. Pain medication, blood pressure medicine, fluids. Then another name caught her eye. Lorazepam, as needed for anxiety. She frowned. "I don't remember taking medicine for anxiety." Emily looked closer. "It appears 1 dose was administered yesterday evening." "I never asked for that." Emily clicked through the record. A small note appeared beneath the order. Family reported patient increasingly anxious and confused. Requested physician review. Margaret's heartbeat quickened. "Family?" Emily nodded. "It doesn't specify who." Margaret already knew. There must be some mistake. "I've never been confused." Emily's smile faded. "I'll ask Dr. Keller to review this with you." Less than 30 minutes later, Dr. Raymond Keller entered the room carrying a tablet. Emily quietly explained Margaret's concern before leaving. Dr. Keller adjusted his glasses. "You had questions about your medications?" Margaret nodded. "I was given something for anxiety." The doctor reviewed the chart. "Yes, a single low dose." "I never asked for it." Dr. Keller frowned. "No, you didn't." He continued scrolling. "This note says a family member expressed concern that you appeared disoriented after your fall." "I wasn't." "I understand." He paused. "To be clear, Mrs. Whitmore, I never diagnosed you with confusion." Margaret felt a chill. Then why was the medication approved? The request was forwarded during evening rounds. The dose was minimal and it wasn't considered harmful. He looked directly at her. "But based on how you're presenting today, I don't believe you require additional sedation." Margaret lowered her voice. "My son asked for it, didn't he?" The doctor remained silent for a moment. Hospital policy prevented him from discussing every conversation with family. Finally he answered carefully. "Your son expressed concern about your stress level. Nothing more." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was enough. After the doctor left, Margaret stared out the window. She remembered Daniel as a little boy who refused to sleep unless she checked under the bed for monsters. The teenager who proudly carried groceries into the house without being asked. The young man who cried at his father's funeral. When had that son disappeared? Or had she simply stopped seeing him clearly? Shortly before noon, Daniel entered carrying a bouquet of fresh daisies. They didn't have lilies today. Margaret smiled politely. "These are lovely. How are you feeling?" "Much better." "Great." He placed the flowers beside the window before opening his briefcase. "Good. Then maybe we can finish those forms." He removed the same folder from the previous day. Everything about his movements looked rehearsed. Confident. Almost eager. "They're just hospital documents," he said. "We'll be done in 5 minutes." Margaret didn't reach for the papers. Instead she asked quietly, "What kind of forms are they?" Daniel blinked. "I told you. Routine paperwork." "I'd still like to know." He laughed softly. "Mom? You've never liked reading legal language. That's why I'm helping." His answer sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Margaret extended her hand. Then let me read them. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Daniel hesitated. It's mostly technical wording. I have time. You'll only confuse yourself. The sentence lingered between them. Margaret slowly lowered her hand. I've read contracts all my life. I think I can manage. Daniel forced another smile and handed her the folder. The documents looked ordinary. Hospital logos, insurance information, consent forms, page after page of dense legal language. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses. After several minutes, frustration settled in. The print was tiny. Her eyes grew tired. Daniel gently leaned closer. See, I told you. It's easier if I explain. Margaret closed the folder. I'll finish reading later. We should really do it now. Why? So everything's ready for discharge. Is the hospital waiting for my signature? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. I assumed they would. Something in his voice lacked certainty. A soft knock interrupted the conversation. Laura Hastings entered carrying a leather briefcase. Margaret's longtime attorney smiled warmly. There you are. Daniel's face immediately stiffened. What are you doing here? Laura ignored him. She walked directly to Margaret. You called? I did. Margaret reached for her hand. I need your help. Daniel stepped forward. Mom, this really isn't necessary. Laura turned calmly toward him. Legal documents are always worth reviewing. They're hospital forms. So you won't mind if I read them. Daniel said nothing. Laura accepted the folder and began turning the pages. Her expression remained neutral. Until page 7. Then page 11. By page 14, she stopped completely. Very slowly she looked up. Mrs. Whitmore. Her voice had lost every trace of warmth. Did anyone tell you exactly what these documents contain? Margaret shook her head. No. Laura carefully separated several pages from the stack. These first forms are legitimate hospital paperwork. She placed them on the table. But these? She lifted another set of documents. Are something entirely different. Daniel's face turned pale. Laura read the title aloud. Durable Financial Power of Attorney. Margaret frowned. What does that mean? Laura answered quietly. It means that if you sign these papers, your son would gain broad legal authority to control your bank accounts, investments, property transactions, and many of your financial decisions. The room fell silent. Margaret stared at Daniel. You said these were discharge papers. Daniel quickly raised his hands. I was trying to simplify things. Laura's eyes never left him. Simplifying something and disguising it are not the same. Margaret slowly closed the folder. For the first time since entering the hospital, she no longer wondered whether Nurse Evelyn had been right. She knew. And as Daniel stood speechless beside the hospital bed, Margaret quietly reached for her phone. There was one conversation that could no longer be avoided. The hospital room fell into a heavy silence. Margaret Whitmore stared at the papers resting on the blanket across her lap. Only minutes earlier she had believed they were ordinary discharge forms. Now they looked completely different. Dangerous. She slowly turned another page while Laura Hastings stood beside the bed. Daniel remained near the window, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Mom? He began carefully. You're making this much bigger than it needs to be. Laura didn't even look at him. No, she said calmly. You did that the moment you mixed legal documents with hospital paperwork. Daniel let out a frustrated sigh. It isn't illegal. No, Laura replied. Not by itself. She pointed to the title printed at the top of the page. Creating a financial power of attorney isn't illegal. Asking someone to sign one without clearly explaining what it is. She paused. Especially while they're recovering from a head injury and receiving medication that can affect judgment. Her eyes met Daniel's. That's a very different matter. Daniel looked away. Margaret picked up the first page again. The letters blurred behind tears she hadn't realized were forming. I trusted you. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You told me these were hospital forms. Daniel immediately stepped closer. They are. Some of them. I wasn't trying to trick you. I was trying to save time. Margaret slowly shook her head. No. You were trying to keep me from asking questions. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Daniel had no immediate answer. Laura carefully organized the documents into 2 separate stacks. These pages, she explained, authorize your insurance company to process medical claims. She placed them on the left. These authorize physical therapy after discharge. Another stack. And these? She held up the remaining pages. Would allow your son to access your checking accounts, sell your home if certain conditions were met, manage your investments, and conduct financial transactions in your name. Margaret looked stunned. My home. Laura nodded. Potentially. Your retirement accounts. Your savings. Even the authority to sign certain contracts on your behalf. Daniel interrupted quickly. Only if she became unable to manage those things herself. Laura answered without raising her voice. And who was telling the medical staff she was becoming confused? Silence. Daniel's face tightened. A gentle knock interrupted them. Dr. Raymond Keller entered with Nurse Evelyn Brooks beside him. I understand there are concerns regarding some legal paperwork, the doctor said. Laura stood. There are. She briefly explained what she had discovered. Dr. Keller listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned to Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, did you tell members of my staff that your mother had become increasingly confused? Daniel hesitated. I said she seemed forgetful. After a fall, I thought it was worth mentioning. Dr. Keller nodded slowly. Concern is appropriate. But repeatedly requesting medication to make a patient calmer. He looked down at the medical chart. Is another matter. Daniel frowned. I only wanted her to rest. Nurse Evelyn finally spoke. 3 different times. Everyone turned toward her. Her calm voice never changed. You asked 3 different nurses whether your mother's medication could be increased. Daniel stared at her. I never demanded anything. No. Evelyn agreed. You smiled. You thanked us. You simply kept asking whether she could be made a little more relaxed before discussing paperwork. The room became painfully quiet. Margaret slowly looked toward Evelyn. So. Her voice trembled. It was you. You were the one who warned me. Evelyn nodded gently. Yes. Why? The veteran nurse took a slow breath. I've worked in hospitals for 32 years. I've cared for thousands of patients. I've learned that genuine love never seems rushed. It waits. It answers questions. It never becomes impatient when someone wants to read before signing. She looked toward Daniel. But manipulation. It almost always sounds polite. Margaret closed her eyes. Every conversation from the past 3 days replayed itself. Trust me. It's only routine. It'll take 5 minutes. You don't need to read all that. She hadn't recognized the pattern. Until now. Daniel suddenly pushed his chair backward. This is unbelievable. He looked at everyone in the room. You're making me sound like a criminal. No one has accused you of a crime, Laura replied. But your actions deserve scrutiny. Daniel laughed bitterly. So because I tried helping my own mother, I'm suddenly the villain? Margaret opened her eyes. Helping me? She spoke softly. Or helping yourself? The question hung in the room. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed again. No answer came. After several moments, Laura carefully placed every legal document back into the folder. She handed it directly to Margaret. These belong to you. No one else. Margaret accepted the folder with shaking hands. Then she looked at her son. I won't be signing anything. Daniel's expression hardened. For now. No. Margaret's voice became stronger. Not ever. I'll make my own decisions. And when I need legal advice. She gently rested her hand on Laura's. I'll ask someone whose only responsibility is protecting me. Daniel looked from Laura to Evelyn, then back to his mother. For the first time, he realized he had lost control of the situation. Later that afternoon, after Daniel left without another word, Margaret remained quietly staring out the hospital window. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the parking lot. Evelyn entered carrying a fresh pitcher of water. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. The nurse looked confused. "For what?" "I almost ignored your warning." Evelyn smiled gently. "Most people would have." She adjusted Margaret's blanket. "The hardest deception to recognize is the one wrapped in kindness." Margaret nodded slowly. "I keep asking myself where I went wrong." "You didn't." Evelyn pulled a chair beside the bed. "People make their own choices. A parent's love shapes a child, but it cannot control the adult they choose to become." A tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. "I still love him." "I know." Evelyn handed her a tissue. "And that's what makes this so heartbreaking. You don't have to stop loving someone." She paused. "To stop trusting them." Margaret quietly folded the tissue in her hands. For the first time since her fall, she understood that recovering from her injuries would be the easy part. Healing a broken heart would take much longer. As evening settled over Maple Ridge Medical Center, another storm was already beginning. Down the hallway, Daniel stood outside the elevators with his phone pressed tightly against his ear. His voice was low, frustrated. The attorney showed up. A long pause. "No." Another pause. "She didn't sign." His jaw tightened. "We're going to need another plan." Unaware that a security camera silently recorded every second he stood there, Daniel ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Inside her room, Margaret had just escaped the trap. Outside that room, Daniel was already searching for another way in. The following morning, Maple Ridge Medical Center no longer felt like the same hospital. The nurses still smiled. Doctors still made their morning rounds. Patients still drifted through the hallways in wheelchairs. But inside Margaret Whitmore's room, everything had changed. Trust had been replaced by questions. And every answer seemed to uncover another painful truth. At 9 o'clock, a firm knock came at the door. Hospital Administrator Susan Mitchell entered, accompanied by Dr. Raymond Keller, Nurse Evelyn Brooks, and a man wearing a navy blazer with an identification badge that read, "Hospital Risk Management." "Mrs. Whitmore," Susan began gently, "we'd like to speak with you regarding concerns that were brought to our attention yesterday." Margaret nodded. "Please." Susan pulled up a chair. "First, I want to assure you that your care and safety remain our highest priorities." She glanced toward Evelyn. Nurse Brooks reported several interactions that she believed warranted further review. Margaret looked at Evelyn. The veteran nurse didn't appear nervous. She simply looked determined. Susan opened a thin folder. "According to nursing notes, your son requested additional medication on multiple occasions." Dr. Keller added quietly, "None of those requests originated from the medical team." Margaret lowered her eyes. "I was told I seemed confused." "You were tired after your fall," Dr. Keller replied. "But every neurological examination showed you remained fully capable of making your own medical decisions." Susan continued, "We also reviewed visitor records." She slid several printed pages across the table. Margaret adjusted her glasses. Daniel's name appeared repeatedly. Nothing unusual. Then another detail caught her attention. Several names had the word denied beside them. She frowned. "My sister Helen came to visit." Susan nodded. "She did. She was informed that you were sleeping and that family preferred no visitors." Margaret looked confused. "I never asked for that." Susan answered softly, "We know." Another page followed. The same notation appeared beside 3 church friends. A neighbor. Even Laura Hastings had been delayed for nearly 40 minutes before finally insisting on seeing Margaret. Someone had been limiting access to her room, and Margaret had never known. Just then there was another knock. Daniel walked in carrying coffee and a paper bag from the bakery. He stopped the moment he saw everyone gathered. His smile faded. "What's going on?" Susan stood. "Mr. Whitmore, we'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." Daniel looked from face to face. "What is this?" Dr. Keller spoke calmly. We're reviewing several concerns regarding your mother's care. Daniel laughed once. This is ridiculous. I've done nothing except stay with my mother. No one disputes that, Susan replied. But we do have questions. She placed another document on the table. On Monday evening, you asked 2 different nurses whether your mother's sedative dosage could be increased. I was worried she wasn't sleeping. The nurses explained that medication wasn't medically necessary. I accepted their answer. Evelyn spoke quietly. For about an hour. Daniel turned toward her. What does that mean? It means you asked me again during my next medication round. And again before my shift ended. Daniel folded his arms. So asking questions is a crime now? No, Susan answered. But repeatedly requesting medication immediately before presenting legal paperwork is concerning. Daniel's expression hardened. They weren't legal papers. Laura, who had quietly entered moments earlier, placed the folder on the table. I believe they were. She removed the financial power of attorney. And this document says otherwise. Daniel said nothing. Susan nodded toward the risk management officer. He opened a laptop. As part of our review, we also examined security footage from outside Mrs. Whitmore's room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. The video began playing. The hallway appeared on the screen. A timestamp showed Tuesday evening. There was Daniel speaking with an unfamiliar man in a gray suit. The footage contained no audio. But several moments later another camera angle appeared. Daniel stood alone near the elevator speaking on his phone. Yeah. No audio. Only body language. Then the officer opened another file. This recording comes from the hallway security microphone positioned near the nurse's station. Hospital policy permitted limited audio recording in common areas for security purposes. The room became silent. Daniel's voice filled the speakers. She didn't sign. Pause. The attorney showed up. Another pause. We'll need another plan. Margaret slowly closed her eyes. There it was. No misunderstanding. No innocent explanation. Another plan. Not concern. Not love. A plan. Daniel abruptly stood. You're taking everything out of context. Susan remained composed. Then help us understand the context. My business has been struggling. I was trying to organize things. Laura answered quietly. By hiding legal documents among hospital forms? Daniel looked at Margaret. I wasn't trying to hurt you. You wouldn't understand. Margaret finally spoke. Then explain it to me. Her voice was calm, gentle, almost pleading. Help me understand. Daniel stared at the floor. For nearly a minute no one spoke. Finally he whispered, I was desperate. He sat back down. His shoulders slumped as though years of pretending had finally become too heavy. The company is failing. I owe more money than I can repay. The bank gave me one last deadline. He swallowed hard. I thought. His voice broke. I thought if I could access the money temporarily, I could fix everything. Margaret looked at him through tear-filled eyes. So you planned to lie to me? I was going to pay it back. You don't know that. I would have. Laura shook her head. Intentions don't erase deception. Daniel covered his face with both hands. I never wanted it to happen like this. Margaret reached for the edge of her blanket. Her hands trembled, not from age but from heartbreak. When your father was dying, she said quietly, he made me promise something. Daniel slowly looked up. He said, no matter how hard life becomes, never let money decide who your family is. A tear rolled down her cheek. I kept that promise. She looked directly into her son's eyes. You didn't. Daniel couldn't hold her gaze. Hospital Administrator Susan closed the investigation folder. Based on the evidence reviewed, we are restricting all legal and financial discussions with Mrs. Whitmore during her hospitalization. She turned toward Margaret. Any future paperwork must be reviewed independently if you request it. Margaret nodded. I appreciate that. Susan looked at Daniel. You may continue visiting your mother, but only as her son. not as her representative. The meaning was unmistakable. The authority Daniel had tried to gain was gone before it had ever begun. After everyone left, only Margaret and Daniel remained. The silence between them felt heavier than any conversation. Daniel stood by the door for several seconds. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Margaret looked at him. "I believe you are. You seem surprised. But being sorry?" She continued softly. "Doesn't repair broken trust." Daniel nodded once. He quietly left the room without another word. Margaret watched the door close. The tears finally came. Not because she had almost lost her savings. Not because she had nearly signed away her future. But because the little boy who once held her hand crossing the street had grown into a man willing to risk everything for money. Outside the hospital window, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Margaret took a slow, steady breath. The hardest decision of her life still lay ahead. She now had to decide whether she could ever face her son again, not as the child she remembered, but as the man he had become. Margaret Whitmore was discharged from Maple Ridge Medical Center 3 days later. The spring sunshine warmed the hospital entrance as a volunteer wheeled her toward the waiting car. Laura Hastings walked beside her, carrying a small overnight bag, while Nurse Evelyn Brooks stood near the automatic doors. "I'm glad you're going home," Evelyn said with a gentle smile. "So am I," Margaret replied. She reached for the nurse's hand. "I don't know how to thank you." Evelyn squeezed her fingers. "You already have. By asking questions." Margaret smiled sadly. "I almost didn't. Most people don't." Evelyn's eyes softened. "But now you know something many people never learn. Trust should never require silence." Margaret nodded before Laura helped her into the passenger seat. As the car pulled away, she looked back one last time. Evelyn stood where they had left her, raising a quiet hand in farewell. Margaret had entered the hospital with a broken hip. She was leaving with a broken heart. The Whitmore house felt strangely unfamiliar. Everything looked exactly as she had left it before the fall. Thomas's rocking chair still rested on the porch. Family photographs still lined the hallway. The antique grandfather clock still chimed every hour. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time in decades, Margaret no longer felt completely safe inside her own home. She found herself wondering which memories had been real, and which ones she had chosen to believe. 2 days later, Laura arrived carrying several folders. "I've prepared everything." Margaret nodded quietly. They sat together at the dining room table where Thomas had once balanced the family checkbook every Sunday afternoon. Laura carefully spread the documents before her. "These papers revoke every financial authorization Daniel currently has." Margaret sighed. "He only had access to one checking account." "Not anymore," Laura continued. "This appoints an independent trustee to oversee your estate if you ever become unable to manage your affairs." Margaret slowly adjusted her reading glasses. "And Daniel?" Laura hesitated. "He remains your son. But he will no longer have legal authority over your finances." Margaret looked at the empty chair where Daniel used to sit during holiday dinners. She picked up the pen. For a long moment she couldn't move. "Then," she signed. One signature. Then another. Each stroke of the pen felt heavier than the last. She wasn't removing her son from her life. She was removing temptation from his. That evening, Margaret called Daniel herself. "Would you come over?" His voice sounded cautious. "Are you okay?" "Yes. I'd just like to see you. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Daniel arrived carrying a grocery bag. "I brought dinner." Margaret smiled faintly. "You always know I like chicken soup." "I remember." The words lingered awkwardly between them. After setting the groceries on the counter, Daniel looked around the quiet kitchen. "So, what did you want to talk about?" Margaret gestured toward the dining room. "Sit with me." He obeyed without another word. For several moments neither spoke. The ticking grandfather clock filled the silence. Finally, Margaret folded her hands together. "I've been thinking about something." Daniel looked up. "When you were 8 years old, you wanted a red bicycle." A faint smile crossed his face. I remember. We couldn't afford it. No. So your father spent 2 months repairing an old bicycle someone had thrown away. Daniel laughed softly. I was disappointed. You cried. I did. But do you remember what happened a week later? Daniel looked down. I realized Dad had painted it red. Margaret nodded. He worked every evening after his factory shift. He never told you. He wanted you to believe miracles were possible. Daniel's eyes began to fill. I haven't thought about that in years. I have. Margaret reached across the table and gently took his hand. Your father taught us something that summer. If you want something, earn it. Don't take shortcuts. Daniel lowered his head. I'm ashamed. Margaret said nothing. I kept telling myself I wasn't stealing. I told myself I was borrowing. I convinced myself I'd pay everything back. His voice cracked. But the truth is, I stopped seeing you as my mother. I started seeing you as the answer to my problems. Tears rolled down his face. I don't know when that happened. Margaret's own tears quietly followed. I believe you. He looked surprised. You do. I believe you didn't wake up one morning planning to betray me. I think it happened one compromise at a time. Daniel covered his eyes. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Margaret answered gently. Forgiveness isn't the same as trust. He slowly looked at her. I forgive you. The words caught him completely off guard. But I cannot trust you with my finances. Not today. Maybe not ever. She reached into a folder resting beside her chair. I've signed new estate documents. Daniel didn't ask to see them. He already knew. I understand. The decisions are final. I know. Margaret hesitated before asking the question that had weighed on her heart for days. If I had no savings. She looked directly into his eyes. If I lived in a tiny apartment. If your father and I had nothing to leave behind. Would you still have stayed beside my hospital bed? Daniel's lips trembled. He opened his mouth. No words came. His silence answered more honestly than any explanation ever could. Finally, barely above a whisper, he admitted, I don't know. Margaret closed her eyes. That single sentence hurt more than every deception that had come before. Because it was the truth. Daniel stood slowly. I think I should go. Margaret nodded. Before leaving, he stopped beside the front door. I'm going to sell the company. I need to pay what I owe. I don't want to spend the rest of my life blaming everyone else. Margaret smiled through tears. That's the first decision you've made in a long time that your father would have been proud of. Daniel nodded silently. Then he walked out into the cool evening air. Margaret watched through the front window as his car disappeared down the quiet street. She wasn't watching a son abandon his mother. She was watching a man begin the long journey of facing himself. Later that night, Margaret sat alone on the porch in Thomas's old rocking chair. The breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs across the yard. She looked toward the stars beginning to appear overhead. I kept my promise, she whispered. Years ago, Thomas had taken her hand during the final weeks of his illness. If I'm gone first. He had smiled weakly. Promise me one thing. Protect our family. Back then, Margaret believed protecting a family meant shielding it from pain. Now she finally understood. Sometimes protecting a family meant refusing to let love become an excuse for dishonesty. It meant telling the truth, even when the truth broke your own heart. She closed her eyes as the porch swing creaked softly in the evening breeze. Tomorrow would be a new day. Daniel's future would be his own to rebuild. And hers would no longer be guided by fear, but by wisdom earned at the highest possible cost. 1 year later, the maple trees lining Main Street had turned green again. Spring had returned to Maple Ridge, bringing with it the familiar sounds of birdsong, children riding bicycles, and neighbors tending flower gardens. To most people, it felt like the beginning of another ordinary season. For Margaret Whitmore, it felt like the beginning of a completely different life. She was walking without a cane now. Her hip had healed. The bruises from the fall had long since faded. But the lessons she had learned inside that hospital had remained with her every single day. Some wounds healed with time. Others became wisdom. The community room at Maple Ridge Senior Center was filled beyond capacity. Rows of elderly residents sat quietly, chatting among themselves while volunteers arranged pamphlets across several tables. The title printed on each brochure read, "Protect yourself from financial exploitation." Near the entrance stood a simple banner, "The Whitmore Senior Protection Fund." Margaret smiled as she looked around the room. Just 6 months earlier, the organization had existed only as an idea shared over coffee with Laura Hastings and nurse Evelyn Brooks. Now it was helping seniors throughout the county recognize the warning signs of financial abuse. Free legal consultations, educational workshops, volunteer advocates, emergency legal referrals. Everything Margaret wished someone had taught her years before. Laura stepped onto the small stage. "I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today." Applause filled the room. This program exists because one person chose to speak when remaining silent would have been easier. She turned toward the front row. Nurse Evelyn Brooks. The audience applauded warmly as Evelyn stood. Embarrassed by the attention, she smiled and gave a small wave. When the applause quieted, Laura continued. "Mrs. Whitmore would also like to say a few words." Margaret slowly walked to the podium. She looked across the room. Nearly 100 faces looked back at her. Some reminded her of herself just a year earlier. Widows, retired couples, grandparents, people who trusted their families because they wanted to believe love alone could protect them. Margaret took a slow breath. "A year ago," she began, "I believed something that many of us believe. If someone loves you, they'll never ask you to do something that isn't in your best interest." She paused. "I learned that life isn't always that simple." The room became perfectly still. I was fortunate. A nurse saw something I couldn't. She risked her career to whisper 5 words that changed my life. Margaret looked toward Evelyn. "Don't trust your son." Several people in the audience exchanged surprised glances. I didn't understand those words. I didn't want to believe them. But they gave me something priceless. She smiled gently. They gave me permission to ask questions. She held up a folder. Inside were copies of ordinary legal documents. If someone places papers in front of you, read them. If your eyes aren't strong enough, ask someone you trust. If someone tells you to hurry, slow down. If someone says, "Just sign here," ask why. A few people quietly nodded. Margaret's voice became softer. "The people who truly love you will never be offended by your questions. They'll answer them. And if they love you, they'll wait." The audience erupted into applause. After the seminar ended, dozens of seniors formed a line to speak with Margaret. One elderly gentleman carried an unopened envelope. "My grandson asked me to sign these. Would you mind looking at them?" Margaret smiled. "I'd be happy to." Nearby, Laura helped another couple schedule a free consultation with a volunteer attorney. Across the room, Evelyn patiently answered questions from caregivers about recognizing manipulation. The foundation was already doing exactly what Margaret had hoped, helping people before it was too late. As the room slowly emptied, Margaret noticed a familiar figure standing near the back exit. Daniel. He looked thinner than she remembered. The expensive suits were gone. Instead, he wore faded jeans and a simple blue shirt. He didn't step forward. He simply waited until the crowd had disappeared. Finally, Margaret walked toward him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel smiled faintly. "I almost didn't come. I'm glad you did." He looked around the room. "You've helped a lot of people." "We've helped a lot of people." He nodded. "I heard you started this because of what happened." "I did." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I've wanted to tell you something." Margaret waited. "I sold the company. I paid back everyone I could. When there wasn't enough, I declared bankruptcy." She quietly listened. "I've been working as a site supervisor for another construction firm. It's honest work. I start before sunrise every day." He smiled weakly. "It's strange. I've never slept better." Margaret could hear something different in his voice. Not confidence. not pride. I still think about Dad, Daniel said. The bicycle. Margaret smiled through tears. He'd be proud that you're rebuilding instead of running. I hope so. Daniel hesitated. I know I can't undo what I almost did. No, you can't. I know. But every morning, I try to become someone who never would. Margaret reached out and gently took his hand. For the first time in over a year, there was no fear, no legal documents, no hidden motives, only a mother and her son sharing an honest conversation. I forgave you a long time ago, she said softly. I just needed to know whether you were willing to forgive yourself. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I'm still working on that. Margaret nodded. That's where healing begins. Before leaving, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. I brought something. He handed Margaret a small wooden box. I made it. She opened the lid. Inside rested an old family photograph. The same picture of Margaret, Thomas, and a smiling 10-year-old Daniel standing in front of their home. The frame surrounding it had been handcrafted from reclaimed oak. On the bottom edge, carefully carved by hand, were a few simple words. Family is built on trust, not inherited. Margaret ran her fingers across the carving. It wasn't an expensive gift. It wasn't meant to erase the past. It was something far more valuable. Proof that the man standing before her was no longer searching for shortcuts. He was learning to build things the way his father always had. One careful step at a time. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Margaret placed the wooden frame on the mantel above Thomas's old fireplace. The setting sun poured through the living room window, bathing the photograph in warm golden light. She smiled. The fall down the stairs had nearly taken away her independence. A whispered warning had saved her future. But the greatest miracle wasn't that she had protected her home or her savings. It was that the truth, painful as it had been, gave her son one final chance to become the man she had always hoped he could be. Outside, children laughed as they rode their bicycles down the quiet street. Inside, Margaret sat peacefully in Thomas's rocking chair, knowing that real wealth had never been measured by what she could leave behind. It would always be measured by the character her family chose to carry forward. And sometimes, the greatest act of love was not saying yes. It was having the courage to say no, until the people you loved found their way back to the truth.